we sit here and do this interview. Tomorrow will be the American elections.
Yep.
We've got Trump against Biden.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of the last 4 years of the Trump presidency? Do you think Trump will go again for another 4-year term?
They're two very different questions.
Okay.
I think that to answer the second one first, the United States Electoral College is a very weird instrument. No other country has anything like it. The fact that you could get 51% of the votes in California, but that translates to 100% of the Electoral College votes, is just staggering to me. And so it could be that we have the same situation we had at the last election, where a candidate who has significantly less support in the electorate overall has the right support in the right places to end up winning the presidency. So I believe that American public opinion has swung sharply away from Mr. Trump, but that doesn't mean that he might not still end up with the right support in the right places to take the election. I think the last 4 years have been tragic for the United States of America. I think that, well, I'll start by saying there have been successes. I mean, encouraging 3 Arabic countries to recognise Israel is a foreign policy success in anyone's books, and you can't pretend that it isn't. There's been a success in the sense that many people, I think, voted for Mr. Trump in order to stick their middle finger up at what they regarded as being the establishment in Washington politics. And certainly the last 4 years have looked nothing like the establishment in Washington politics. But on the downside, the economy is terrible. The economy was going south prior to coronavirus. Mr. Trump himself just simply seems to be a broken narcissist who sees everything in mercantile terms. He sees everything in terms of what do I personally get out of this, as opposed to what do others get out of this. I think that the comment that Mr. Trump, when he was in Normandy looking at the graves of soldiers from D-Day, asked what was in it for them. You know, were they just fools and suckers? The fact that he was unable to see the idea of self-sacrifice and see the idea of serving a community is really tragic, and it's played itself out in situations like the coronavirus, where people have just been asked to wear a damn mask, right? It's not a big ask, and mask wearing has somehow become a civil right. If you went back to the early 1960s and you had JFK saying, "Ask not what my country can do for me, but what I can do for my country," most Americans would say, "Screw you, I've got rights." So there's been a really dramatic change in the way that Americans see themselves. I'm not sure whether Trump is the cause of that or whether he's a symptom of it, but really the last 4 years have just... I love the United States. I've travelled to the United States. I think that over its history, the United States has tried very hard to be a force for good in the world, but the last 4 years have just been a tragedy.
And how much of a role do you believe the media might play in American politics?
Well, they have a much more diverse media in the United States than we have here in Australia. So there are lots and lots of different media outlets. My concern is that social media tends to show people only messages that they already believe, and a lot of people get most of their news these days from social media. But even beyond that, I mean, there's an American news magazine called The Atlantic Monthly that I subscribe to, and probably 80% of its opinions align with about 80% of my opinions. And that's one of the reasons I like to read it. Whereas what I really should be doing is reading some out-and-out redneck publication that has a completely different perspective to mine, to expose myself to that different perspective. But we don't, do we? We tend to look for messages that resonate with us. And so I think that if you're enamoured with Mr. Trump, you would be focusing mainly on media sources that would tell you this is the best president we've ever had. If you're antagonistic towards Mr. Trump, then you're probably focusing on news sources that say Trump is the Antichrist. And what we're not getting is any crossover from these two polarised positions. So we've got these heavily entrenched camps of Americans who are lobbing bombs at each other, figuratively. Yeah. We're not getting any dialogue, and that's the real problem. The problem is not that people hold certain positions. People should be completely entitled to absolutely adore Mr. Trump. But there needs to then be a dialogue between them and others, because if you don't have a dialogue, you don't have a democracy.
And what about fake news? How damaging do you think this is to society?
I think fake news is a fake concept. I mean, when they talk about fake news, most of the time what they're talking about is opinions that they disagree with. And if you disagree with an opinion, that's fine. We have processes for that. You argue against that opinion. You explain why that opinion's wrong. If there's a fact that you disagree with, well, we have processes for that too. You know, you go and you produce your evidence to show that this fact is right or this fact is wrong. What the concept of fake news, what that really does is it just reinforces the polarisation I was talking about a few minutes ago. So this group over here have their own set of facts and their own way that they believe and interpret those facts. And this group over here have their own set of facts and their own way that they believe and interpret those facts. And there's never any dialogue between. And it's really the dialogue, the lack of dialogue is the problem. Because if you completely believe something, you completely believe something's true, and I come along with a completely different perspective, and I can communicate that with you, that's when you might start to think, maybe he's got a point. Maybe I need to reassess the things that I'm thinking. Unless you get the dialogue, it never happens.
And have it presented in the right way to you?
Well, absolutely, because simply getting in someone's face and telling them that they're wrong is just likely to further entrench them in their view. But at this point, I'd even be happy with that because there's no dialogue going on at all.
Okay, let's move away from politics.
Let's.
Interesting question. I understand you have a weird religious perspective, if we can call it that.
I do have a weird religious perspective, and yes, for those of us who follow what it is a religion. So I follow what we call the way of the Force. So people might refer to us as Jedi, but that's not a term that we tend to use. Basically, the idea is that all living and non-living things are united and connected by a living force, and that as human beings, every time we make a decision, we have the opportunity to make that decision on the good side of the force or on the dark side of the force. And if we act out of love or out of generosity or out of kind-spiritedness, then we're making decisions on the good side of the force. If we act out of anger or greed or jealousy, then we're making decisions out of the dark side of the force. And even if this is all nonsense, even if it's all just nonsense from a movie, if you looked at me and said, this guy can either be the guy who's trying to make decisions made on kindness, decisions made on generosity, decisions made on good-spiritedness, or he can be the guy who's making decisions based on antagonism and jealousy and hatred, which would you want me to be? And so if I have this philosophy that says that what I should try to do in my life is make as many decisions as I can on the good side of the force and as few decisions as I can on the bad side of the force, ultimately I'm going to be a better person. And if everybody did that, ultimately we'd have a better world. And I don't have to believe in a God, and I don't have to follow what someone wrote in some book 2,000 years ago. All I have to do is try really, really hard to make decisions on the good side of the force. And if it's nonsense, but it makes me a better person living a better life, then sign me up for the nonsense.
Sounds like a good theory to me.
Hey, it works for me. Look, honestly, in the 10 years or so since I found the way of the force, I've become a better person, living a better life, doing better things, and I like that.
And if you're going to sit around a campfire with 3 people you most admire, who would they be?
My dad would be the first one. My father's a 40-something year military veteran, Vietnam veteran. It would embarrass both of us, I think, if I tried on camera to say just how very much I admire the man that my father is, other than to say that he is always, to me, the role model that I'll never quite reach. And so, he would be the first choice for me. The second would be a man named Branch Rickey. He was a United States Major League Baseball manager, but he was the one who decided to sign Jackie Robinson to play in the major leagues. So he decided at a time when no black man was allowed to play in the majors, he decided to sign Jackie Robinson up, and he decided to put him on the team and let him play as the first black man to play in the major leagues. And gosh, it must have been hard to do that. Gosh, it must have been hard to stand up against an entire industry and an entire society and say, what we're doing is wrong. This man is an excellent baseball player. I don't care what the colour of his skin is. He's going to be on my team. And everyone remembers Jackie Robinson, and so they should. I mean, 42 was unique in the history of baseball as a player. But people should remember Branch Rickey too, because if it wasn't for Mr. Rickey, Jackie Robinson would have never stepped out onto Dodger Stadium in the 1950s when he did.
The starting of a new era, yes?
Just the power of one individual person to say, I'm going to do the right thing. And he changed all of, it was one of the most significant events in that sort of 50s and 60s development of civil rights in the United States was Branch Rickey saying, he was a very determined Christian, and he was saying, this is a man who is made in the image of God the same as I am. He's a very good baseballer, and he's going to play on my team. And I would just love to be able to sit down with Branch Rickey and talk about what he did to make that decision. The third one would be General Sir John Monash, who was the Australian general who won the First World War. He looked at the years of slaughter in the trenches in the First World War, and he worked out how to combine tanks and aircraft and artillery and rehearse them and do everything perfectly so that he could break out of those trenches. And in a battle called the Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July 1918, they were supposed to take an extraordinary amount of land in 90 minutes, and they did it in 93. And Hamel became the pattern for the later battle, in the Battle of Amiens, and that was the day that the Germans said they lost the war. And so here's this Australian Jewish engineer from Melbourne who went overseas and became a general despite the fact that anti-Semitism was still very strong in England at that time. He wasn't part of, he was just an engineer. He wasn't part of any ruling class or he didn't have any strong class background, but he probably shortened the war by years and saved millions of lives. And then in 1919 found himself with thousands and thousands of Australians, none of whom had any way to get home yet because there were only so many boats. And so he invented the TAFE system. He went around and said, I'm going to find all the carpenters and all the saddle makers and all the different tradesmen. And then if you haven't got a trade, you're going to go and learn from them so that by the time you go home from the war, you're going to have a trade. So nobody has to sit around for 9 months waiting for the boat. You're going to spend those 9 months becoming a boot maker or becoming a saddle maker or whatever. And so these guys went home with a trade. Amazing. I just stand in awe of people who change history in that way.
Amazing.
It's just amazing.
Totally. Okay, and for all that you've done, all that you've achieved, you're a pretty chilled guy. What's your secret?
I don't think I'm chilled at all. I don't think anyone who knows me would say that I'm chilled. I'm just a little ball of stress a lot of the time. But when I'm teaching, when I'm making the videos, I'm really doing something that I love. And one of the things that I think about with teaching is that students are smart. Students are really smart, and you can't fake it with them. The students know whether you want to be there teaching them or not. The students know whether you're on their side and trying to give them information and help them to be successful or not. And I think that one of the reasons that I'm successful with students is because I really do want people to be successful. And I really get a kick out of it. I used to really get a kick out of being able to give a student an unexpectedly high mark. I would never do it unless they absolutely deserved it, but geez, I got a kick out of being able to say, you know, that this student had gotten a great mark. And so I think that if you're looking at me on YouTube or in any teaching environment, you're probably seeing me at my best and happiest. So maybe that accounts for it.
Your passion definitely comes across in your videos.
I sure hope so.